Shay. Hey, Gene, how you doing?
Hey, Ray, how are you? Nice to have you.
Yeah,
I'm so used to saying nice to have you on my program, and this is your program. But
well, you know, I was thinking you've probably interviewed thousands of people in the last, 5 years?
7 years.
7 years.
Yeah.
And every once in a while, I think it's good to turn the tables and to interview you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it is. Actually, it's quite relaxing because you have to do the work, and I can just sit here and sort of pick my answers.
Gene Shay has been a DJ, folk DJ, as we said, for 47 years. And he's called the Dean of American Music DJs. Did I get that right?
The Dean of American Folk DJs.
Folk DJs, yes. And also a founder of the Philadelphia Folk Festival, and also been described as the godfather of Philadelphia folk music. And Gene, you're known not just over the country, but I would suspect over the world, because your show goes over the internet.
I guess so. The internet, I mean, I do get, now that I'm on folkalley.com twice a week, I'm starting to get emails from all over, Latin America, Europe. Mainly questions, sometimes requests, but quite frankly, most of the time it's questions, or it's a letter from someone who remembered hearing me when they were growing up in Philly.
Right.
That's where my home base is. Pardon me. And that's where my shows emanated from for so many years. So I do get calls, and they say, boy, am I glad to hear that you're still doing a show. I grew up listening to you when I was 14 years old, and here I am living in Argentina, and I happened to get you on the internet and was thrilled.
I was going to ask you to kind of give a synopsis of all your folk music and related music stuff since you began. What you've
I've
done.
worked in so many different aspects of folk music, from being one of the founders of the Folk Festival to being on the board of the Philly Folk Song Society, being on the board of the Charter Board when the North American Folk and Dance Alliance started. I was there, part of that, and I was on that Charter Board of Directors. And over the years, I've produced concerts, brought Bob Dylan to Philadelphia for his first show. I was the guy that named World Cafe. That's another interesting story, but we'll skip. There's just so many stories. And what else have I done? Well, I've just emceed a zillion concerts in lots of festivals, not only the Philly Folk Festival for all of its 46 years, but festivals like Apple Farm, Spring Gulch, the Pine Barrens Festival, the Bridgeton Festival, the South Shore Festival. I think I did say Apple Farm. So every summer I'm pretty busy. I've also emceed occasionally at the Falcon Ridge Festival. So, I've been seen on stage a lot, listened to a lot on many of the radio stations. I think I've worked at maybe a total of 6 or 7 radio stations over the years, and quite often for a stint. Each station. I may have worked, I'm an XPN right now, and I've worked here for 16 years. Before that, 15 or 16 years at WHYY, another public radio station in Philadelphia. And before that, usually was, ironically, it was commercial stations. Worked a lot at commercial stations that were rock and roll stations during the week, and then folk music on Sunday evenings. And that's another thing about my show. It's been on Sunday evenings for ages. I mean, almost since the beginning. Very rarely did I deviate from that. For a while, sometimes I did it during the afternoon. I experimented with it in the morning. But you know what? I love doing it at night, and I love doing it on Sunday night. A lot of people are getting ready to go to bed and get up to go to work the next day. But I get them in a very relaxed mode. I would think that maybe 60% of my audience is lying flat on a bed or on a sofa.
I know I have.
In the horizontal position is a good way to hear music.
That's correct. Yeah. We listened to Joni Mitchell, the first song we listened to, and I thought maybe you could, I know you have some interesting stories about her, and I thought we could hear one of them.
Sure. Joni Mitchell history, if you want to look into the books that were written about her, or the documentaries that were done about her, you'll find that my name crops up occasionally. And one time it was quite important that it cropped up because my show was the first show where she performed both sides, and the first time it was ever heard on the radio. It was on my radio show in 1967. She had just written it. She was inspired by reading a book by Saul Bellow, and she wrote it in Philadelphia 3 days before she performed it on my show. The way it worked was something like this. She sang it after she wrote it, say on a Tuesday or Wednesday. She sang it on Thursday night and Friday night and Saturday night. That's the way the booking ran at the old Second Fret Coffee House. So a lot of people got to hear it for the first time, and they were thrilled with the song. So let's just move ahead a couple of days to Sunday when I got on my show, when I got on the air, and I said, hey, guess who's coming over? Joni Mitchell. She's over at the Second Fret now. She'll be over later. So if you want to make some requests, call them in. Gave out the phone number. Started to get some calls, and of course we got calls for some of the old Joni Mitchell stuff like Circle Game or Chelsea Morning.
Mm-hmm.
But a couple of calls came in for Both Sides Now, a song I had never heard, and I never heard the title. And I wasn't sure what they were talking about, but I wrote it down. And then when Joni came in, I said, hey, Joni, and I said it on the air, look, take a look at that list over there. That's a list of the people have called in with the different songs you want to hear. And I heard her say, oh, they're asking for Both Sides Now. That's great. I just wrote that. And then I asked her later to tell me a little bit about it, and she prefaced singing the song by telling the story of how she read this book and came across a phrase that inspired her to think about seeing clouds from above in the sky in an airplane and seeing them from below. And she sort of like used that and paralleled it with examining love affairs, and love in general. She's looked at it from a lot of different angles and still can't figure it out, just the way she can't figure out the clouds. You know, if they're so beautiful, like ice cream castles standing in the air, how come they bring me cloudy days and rainy spells, you know, and otherwise there's the downside to love, there's the downside. So she put that together in a wonderful song, beautiful language. She was always great with language. And after she'd sang it, I said, wow, when did you write that? And she said, 3 days ago or 4 days ago. And it flipped me out that that song was that new. And this was the radio, and this was the first time she ever performed it on the radio, on a music show. I think she was on an interview show on Saturday night. She may have performed it then. I think she did. But that was a sort of a showbiz kind of interview show with lots of different comedians and ventriloquists who came on, and then Joni Mitchell came on. I don't think that was the right audience, but for my audience, what a perfect song.
Yeah,
and it still is a perfect song.
Yeah.
And then Tom Rush recorded it. Other people started to pick up on it, and it took her a while to record that song. You know, Tom Rush was the one that sort of popularized it.
Oh, really?
In the folk community, yeah. She was just a wonderful, very talented, creative person who was always walking around with a set of colored pencils and a sketch pad. And when she wasn't writing songs, she was sitting there and she was coloring, she was doing pictures and designs and stuff. And her hands were always busy. Her mind was always busy. She was a beautiful woman who loved to dress. At the time I knew her, she was in two different phases of dress. She either wore sort of Marine uniforms, like mask, you know, sort of like oversized military, colorful military wear, sort of the Sergeant Pepper kind of feel. Or she was wearing antique clothing. Years later, when I asked her about all her beautiful gowns and long dresses and you know, those things, she said, you know what, Gene, they were the whole my suitcase with all of that stuff was stolen in an airport. So that went bye-bye. But she was great, and it was great in my lifetime to know her, to see her work, to see her be so creative, and just one of the great things in my life.
Well, I throughout our talking, I'm going to say some names and ask you to say some things. Some of them we're going to actually hear songs, sure. Others not. And I wanted to say Bob Dylan.
Well, Bob Dylan, my association with Dylan really started in 1962 when I first got his album. That was his very first Columbia album. That was pretty much a folk album. And at the time, I think I was the only one who played that album. The only one, because I was doing the only folk show in the Philadelphia area. By the way, about a year after that, there were 6 folk shows in Philly. Because
really?
The folk boom,
what
they call the folk scare.
Yeah, yeah.
That happened. Suddenly, every station, not every, many stations. The classical music station in Philly at the time, WFLN, station called Wi-Fi, WIFI, 2 or 3 others, or they had some folk programs.
Right.
But my show had started earlier and was the only one. And so I was the only one really playing Dylan doing Man of Constant Sorrow and Gospel Plow and the song he wrote to Woody Guthrie. And I fell in love with his music. And it was right around a time when we needed to do a concert for the Philadelphia Folk Song Society. And my wife said, hey, why don't we love this Dylan album. Why don't we see if he'll come to Philly? But we knew he was in New York because he was hanging out at Gertie's Folk City, and everybody was sort of catching on to this little ragamuffin kind of guy who wandered in and knocked everybody out with his songs. So I called Albert Grossman's office, and I got a guy named John Court who worked for Albert, and I said, I'd like to bring them to Philly. We can't pay much money. We're a nonprofit educational organization, Philadelphia Folk Song Society. But I wound up bringing him in and emceeing that show at the Ethical Society on Rittenhouse Square in Philadelphia in 1963, early in 63. That was the first time he ever appeared in Philadelphia.
Yeah, I remember.
And
I don't remember it, but I remember that story.
He did the Ballad of Hollis Brown. He did the Song to Woody, and, as I said, some of the other songs I mentioned. Just the Freight Train Blues. Just good stuff,
Right.
And that album still holds up. I love it. Love his version of Man of Constant Sorrow and the way he played the mouth harp. To me, that was a very revealing album. It showed that contemporary, rather traditional folk music could be done in a sort of a hip, contemporary style. And that was sort of like the beginning of, it wasn't too many years afterwards that Dylan went electric at the Newport Folk Festival.
Right. How about John Denver?
John Denver, was a wonderful performer and a terrific guy, just a sweet guy who had a lot of great stories. He got into the business as a folk singer. I guess he was in Colorado or California, in that area. And there was a famous trio, the Chad Mitchell Trio, that used to do a lot of great songs, a lot of funny novelty songs. Chad Mitchell decided he wanted to go into a musical comedy, and he was the key guy, and he was a very good-looking guy and a great, sweet voice. So they had auditions for the Chad Mitchell Trio, someone to replace. They were trying to find someone to replace Chad Mitchell. John Denver came to the audition, sang a few songs, and they said, he's the one we want. And that's how Denver sort of got his name around. He was the key man. He was the centerpiece of the Chad Mitchell Trio. And he came to a Philly Folk Festival with the trio. And he was wonderful. And when we did workshops, sometimes without the trio, just him, and he was doing some of his own songs, not just folk songs, they were terrific. A couple of years later, he wrote Leaving on a Jet Plane. And he was a single. Then he went with another duo. He left the Chad Mitchell Trio, and the trio was called Denver, Boise, and Johnson. And it's interesting, at the Philly Folk Festival, there's sort of a rule of thumb that you don't have the same artist back year after year. Maybe 2 years in a row, but even that was an oddity. Usually, somebody, if Tom Rush played, he wouldn't come back for 2 years. Then they bring him back because there were some players that were wonderful. And people would ask for them, can you get him back? And we say, well, we can't do it 2 years in a row. We'll get him the next year. But Denver, because he was at first he came with the Chad Mitchell Trio to the Philly Folk Festival. The next year he was there with Denver, Boise, and Johnson. The next year, so there's 3 years in a row, he came by himself, John Denver. So he was at the festival many more times in a row than any other artist in the early days. Things have changed since then, but he loved to tell jokes. He was a great storyteller, funny guy. And
join us, my guest today is Gene Shay, a longtime folk DJ in Philadelphia. I wanted to talk about the folk revival, and what I wanted to ask you, because I've heard different explanations, like Phil Oakes, I know, had an explanation, as to why that happened, why folk music became popular, part of the popular music for a period of time.
Well, the folk revival of the 60s, a lot of people ask me about what I think happened there to make it work and make it happen. And I think it was just a combination of a couple major elements. Number one was the demographics. There were a lot of kids, young kids, who had just started college, just leaving high school. Now, I'm not sure if that's because they weren't baby boomers, I don't think, but they were just the way the generation worked, that we had a overabundance of kids who were going to right around high school, college age, more so than ever before. And They were looking for something to do. The 50s were sort of a boring time, not very eventful. They called it the silent generation. There weren't very many activists because there wasn't much to be active about. But in the 60s, there was something to be very active about, and that was the Vietnam War and the escalating war that was very unpopular. There were two schools of thought on that. But it was a rallying cry, the war, for protests against a government that many people thought was corrupt or misguided or whatever. And it was an opportunity to write a song. I mean, suddenly protest songs, which had been around for a long time in folk music. You know, Woody Guthrie was writing songs about unions and about bad conditions in the mines many years before, but not many people knew those songs. But Pete Seeger, when he took an old spiritual, and We Shall Overcome, and used it for the civil rights movement in the beginning of the 60s, and other people like Phil Oakes wrote a song like I'm Not Marching Anymore, those songs became anthems for a young generation, a huge generation. It was so huge that Woodstock proved that we could rule the world almost if you were young enough. You know, it seemed that way for a while. So that was an exciting time for all those young people. It was a peace, love, dove. There was a whole bunch of what they used to call hippies, I guess, and even before that, they were beatniks. They were the kids that wanted to play guitar. I mean, there was other reason. Another reason is the social aspect. Guys wanted to meet girls, and playing the guitar and writing a song, or singing a song and singing it well, made you the center of attention.
I think that still exists.
I think it does too. Yeah, absolutely. So, but so you put all those things together: the protest against the war and the growing feeling that this war was wrong and should be stopped. The amount of young kids who didn't have much to do. Some of them dropped out of college. Some of them were like just looking for jobs, but they wanted to meet girls. They wanted to make friends, and they could buy a harmonica. They could buy a cheap guitar and learn a couple of chords. That's the other thing about folk music. It's very participatory, and it doesn't require a great deal of musical knowledge or musical skill. It sure helps if you have musical knowledge, but you don't have to learn how to pick a guitar like a Leo Kottke. You can just pick it up and strum it. And if you know your 3 or 4 chords or more, you're suddenly a folk singer, aren't you?
I know that very well.
Right. And, of course, as you become more popular in your crowd, or if you start to play clubs and do open mics, you tend to learn from other artists, other performers, and also from taking classes, and you improve your own proficiency in the instrument. Suddenly you're able to do some picking and doing some fancy stuff.
You mentioned Phil Oakes, and I wanted to ask you about Phil.
Yeah, we should play some Phil.
Okay.
You got a good one? How about
we do I in March?
Why don't we? There's
Okay.
one of the main anthems of the protest of Phil Oakes and thousands of others.
Well, you had Phil, and I know in your show, and I think I read that he stayed at your house at times.
He's been over there a couple of times. We had dinner, and he was an old friend. He's a nice guy and very smart and very funny and sort of weird in certain ways, but what a talent. He had a great sense for melody. I love the way he sang. There's some people who sing like they're not like singers. They sound like they're like dancers, like Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly.
Yeah.
I always liked the way they sing. It didn't have any artifice. Didn't have any overly ornate style to it. It's pretty flat and straight out, but it was honesty. Mm-hmm. That's what I liked about it, the honesty of it, just coming out straight, So, and Phil had that quality in his voice. He sang, you knew he meant it, and his voice was pleasant with just a nice, slight nasal quality that gave it a special edge for me. So, I was a real admirer of his, and of course he took his life at a much too young age, and it's always too young when you take your own life, but in this case, what a loss, and it was quite a shock to, when did he go? I think in the
76, I believe.
76, yeah.
30 years.
He had some bad years. In fact, as the Vietnam War wound down.
Mm-hmm.
He really didn't have a raison d'etre. Great talent that died much too young, left us a legacy of great songs, not just protest songs. I mean, he took a poem by Alfred Noyes, that famous epic ballad about the highwayman, and put it to his own music and made it into something very special. He did the same thing with Edgar Allan Poe's poem about the bells, the tintinnabulation of the bells.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He recognized a good, solid lyric, and he was able to put his own sweet melody to it. And isn't it funny that his music still survives and still has relevance?
Absolutely.
His song about the Kitty Genovese story, the
outside a small circle
of friends, the a girl gets attacked and raped and knifed to death, and right in front of an apartment building full of windows, looking right out on the scene, and nobody came to her aid. Nobody called the police. It was like that kind of non-caring. I don't want to be bothered. I don't want to be involved. That kind of attitude still goes on today, and it happens. And when it does, that's a perfect song to play. It's perfectly legitimate, perfectly valid, makes sense.
I'll tell you what, let's listen to I Ain't A-Marching Anymore. And I'm sitting here with Gene Shay and talking about his experiences over the last 40-plus years in radio. And this has been part one of an interview with Gene Shay. Part 2 will run in a few days. If you would like to hear the entire interview, go to my main Live 365 page and click the link to my podcast. Here with Gene Shay and talking about his experiences over the last 40-plus years in radio and related folk music stuff. You're also involved with your own record company called Slice Breads.
Yes.
And you've been doing that for about how long?
It seems like it's about 12 to 14 years now. I'm not exactly sure, but I do know that we were talking about Phil Oakes before and listening to him. One of my highlights of my record label career, having my own record label with my partner Carl Apter, is that I was able to produce an album that was sort of a dream of mine, and that was to take Phil Oakes songs that I liked and have other artists do their interpretation of those songs. So I did a box set called What's That I Hear? And there's not one song sung by Phil Oakes, but every one of those songs was written by Phil Oakes.
Yeah.
And they were done by everybody from Arlo Guthrie to Peter Yarrow, Peter, Paul, and Mary, and,
John Gorka. A bunch of them. Yeah, he's on
David Buskin, lots of good people.
It's a great...
that's one of the highlights of my career as far as producing albums. And, of course, probably the key album that I produced that I'm really proud of is the box set. It's a historic album. It's the 40th anniversary anthology.
Well,
40th anniversary of the Philadelphia Folk Festival.
I've played a number of songs on the show.
And that goes back. I have cuts on there from just about every year, including the very first, the 1962 year, when Pete Seeger was there, and Bonnie Dobson and Reverend Gary Davis.
Who were some other artists on the label?
On my label? Oh, we had some great singers. John Flynn, Susan Piper. Mm-hmm. We had Bob Hillman, who's very talented songwriter. Magpie, Terry and Greg.
Right.
Who else? We have Peggy Seeger. I'm forgetting a bunch.
That's okay.
But
they're all really great artists.
Yeah.
Another guy we're going to listen to his music, Peter Himmelman.
Peter Himmelman, yeah. Peter Himmelman is married to Bob Dylan's daughter. So Dylan is his father-in-law.
Okay.
And a couple interesting things about him. First of all, he's a great songwriter. We go hear there's a song I love. I hope you can find this song in your library. But if it's called Those Impermanent Years. Mm-hmm. Or Impermanent Times. I mean, he just talks about the fleeting times, the fleeting years, the fleeting moments of your life. I mean, they're not going to be here. They're going to be here for just a little short while, and you appreciate them while you have them, So, but one thing about him is that he's an Orthodox Jew, and he always wears a hat, not necessarily a skull cap or one of those big black Hasidic hats. He wears usually a bandana around his head, or a funny
Right.
straw hat or something like that. And he also doesn't work on the Jewish holidays, and I don't think he works on the Sabbath either. But he writes some great songs. He's recorded a number of albums. And one of the things about him that I found very unusual and interesting was that when I was interviewing him the very first time, he kept looking at me, staring at me, and just sort of couldn't keep his eyes off of me, and I was a little self-conscious about it. And then when I did play one of his records after we talked for a long while, he said to me, "Look, I'm sorry if I keep staring at you, but my father died 3 years ago, and you look exactly like my father."
Hmm.
And I said, "Geez, I didn't know what to say." And you know what? That was on Father's Day. Ironically.
Really?
Yeah, many years ago. So I finally did get to see a picture of his dad, and we do look a little alike. His father, he included on one of his albums on the inside the jewel box, there was an old photo of his dad sitting at the dining room table. So Peter Himmelman, great songwriter and interesting dude, and Bob Dylan's son-in-law. That was one of the most unusual interviews. I guess that's why I'm here. I am fudging it.
Okay.
It's either those impermanent years or these impermanent times or days. Or something.
Well, as they say, it's close enough.
The word is impermanent, friends.
Close enough for folk,
exactly.
as we say.
Now you're going to ask me what key it was in, right?
No, that's
I don't
okay.
know. I don't know. I'm sorry. No keys. That's not for me.
Now, I wanted to ask you, you've been on the radio for 47 years, and you've had many artists or singers, maybe they're less than artists, wanting to get on your show, wanting to get you to play their music. How do you deal with that?
Well, I mean, first of all, I have to hear them, and I insist that I hear them. I'm not going to put anybody on, even if somebody said, well, I shouldn't say it. If Peter Yarrow or Joni Mitchell said to me, "You got to hear this girl, she's really terrific, and she has a wonderful new song," I would not only would I listen, go out of my way to find it, but if I didn't have the chance to do that, I'd say, "Well, tell her, give me a call, and I'll have her on next week if she's going to be in Philly."
Right.
He's going to be. So I will take recommendations for people that I have a lot of respect for their taste. But if it's somebody out of the blue that I never heard of, who just comes to me and say, "Hey, I'm a songwriter and I have a couple of new songs and just recorded my album. Can you have me on your show?" I'll say, "Well, I'll think about that, but I'd like to hear you first." It's that's just sort of the prerequisite. Let me hear what you sound like. And I've actually had people call me up and didn't have enough time to get the album to me, so they sang a song to me over the telephone.
Oh, really?
I mean, I can recognize. I mean, I think I'm experienced enough at this point in my life, in my career, to be able to hear something within 40 seconds and tell you whether it's good quality and tell you whether it's a good song or beginning of a good song. So I've done that. I really would rather hear the song, not so much produced. I like to hear the bare bones song, just guitar and voice. That's usually my way of enjoying music. So I just get a lot of albums, a lot of demos that come my way by mail or dropped off to me. Too much and too many of them. And nowadays it's gotten to the point now that people can record their own demo CD in their basement or in their kitchen. Everybody's now a recording star or a recording artist, and I can't keep up with. My show's only on once a week. I only have so many spaces, you might say, for new stuff.
Right.
One thing about any kind of show is it should have some familiarity. It should have some of the things that people want to hear that are popular at that particular time. So I can't turn the show into an all new cuts kind of show. I'd lose a lot of people and also I think it would be doing disservice to my old listeners who. Once somebody said to me, Gene, I was really floored by this. They said, "I love your show. It's so predictable." And I thought, predictable? I want to be full of pleasant surprises. And I still can be, but I know then I analyzed what this young woman was saying. She meant that she knew that she could turn my show on and hear within 10 minutes, she could hear a song that she knew that she could sing along with, or a song that she loved. Jackson Brown doing These Days, Ian Matthews, doing Seven Bridges Road, you know what I mean? Joni Mitchell doing Urge for Going.
Right.
I mean, because I always do play some of those old chestnuts and work them in along with new stuff. But I also want to have that air of discovery. I want to have that unpredictability of having someone say, wow, I was listening to your show and all of a sudden you play this song. I never heard anything like it before. It was by so-and-so. And I say, oh, yeah, aren't they great, you know? So my love is, and one of my passions, I guess you'd say, is to turn people on to new music and new songs, to let them hear something they haven't heard that I like a lot and hope that they're going to like it. Quite often it's the same. I often think to myself that the thing I like about my listening audience is they have the same taste as I do, or at least most of them do.
Yeah.
I get that drift, that feeling from years of talking to my audience and getting to meet them. And when they tell me they love this and they love that, I say, yeah, isn't that great? I mean, I love to talk about music, and to have somebody like what I like, all of a sudden they're my buddy. I mean, they have this. It's great to have so many good friends and just acquaintances that have a similar taste.
Well, I know when I programmed my show, as well as 25 years ago when I did this little show at Widener University, Saturday morning, 10 watts, went about 4 blocks probably, is a combination of all kinds of acoustic music. Some folk shows that I've heard, they're either mostly traditional or mostly singer-songwriter.
Right.
And basically I stole that from me because I thought it was great, a mix of all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, well, that's an eclectic show. That's what I do. Some people, I mean, now that there are so many folk shows around the country being done by young people, old people, and community radio stations and college radio stations, and even some commercial stations. Now there's such a diversity. You know, it's not unusual to find people who just do bluegrass shows. All they play is bluegrass for their entire 2 hours. Or somebody who does only Celtic. Or just like Fiona Ritchie doing her Thistle and Shamrock, specialists in a particular area. I always wanted to be sort of a generalist because I love Celtic and I love bluegrass and I love old Appalachian music and I like modal minor key banjo stuff and unusual tight harmony singing, even if it's, shape note singing or Southern gospel. So I like to be very general in my programming, and I do love to every now and then put in something that I wouldn't normally play, like Lambert Hendricks and Ross tune. So when it came time for Joni Mitchell to record an album, and she decided to put, my analyst told me, the song Twisted, I was right out of my head. That didn't flip me out because I knew Joni had that kind of taste to appreciate that kind of thing. But the fact that she was daring enough to put that on an album made me feel good because I was sort of daring enough in my own way to put that on a folk show. That wouldn't normally belong on a folk show.
Right.
It's a hip jazz piece. But so what? I play Mose Allison doing the blues, and I play novelty tunes by people that you wouldn't expect. I might play Tiny Tim on the ukulele,
Yeah. Oh, and another guy, we're going to listen to one of his songs, Dan Hicks.
Yeah, Dan Hicks and the Hot Licks. I was always been a fan of his, and I'd liked his music. Never got to meet him. But one time when he was playing at the Main Point, and they used to do this often, there'd be 2 artists playing the bill, an opening act and then the main act. So I guess Dan Hicks and the Hot Licks were the main act that night. This was years and years ago. Main Point was a famous club in the Bryn Mawr, the suburban area of Philadelphia. And opening for him was Michael Nesmith. Now, many people probably know who Michael Nesmith is today. He was a member of the band called the Monkees. He wrote some of their best songs. He also wrote some great songs like some of Shelley's Blues, which was sort of a minor hit by the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band. And he wrote a lovely song called Joanne, which we might be able to hear today.
Yeah, we're going to play that later.
And they were both working at the same club at the same time. So they decided to come over together. Dan Hicks did not bring any of the members of his band. It was just an interview that was scheduled. I was at WMMR at the time in Center City. That's where our studios were. Center City, Philadelphia, right on Rittenhouse Square. Well, they came over, and I think maybe Dan had a couple too many beers after the work because he was a little out of sorts, and he was sort of grumpy. And every time I asked him a question, he wouldn't give me a direct answer. It was sort of like being cutesy, making jokes and sort of like I got the feeling that his attitude was, let's get the media guy, let's get the DJ, let's put him in his place. Meanwhile, his friend here, the guy who came over with him, Michael Nesmith, I wanted to hear his songs too, and he was much more pleasant and a nicer person than Dan. At least he hadn't been drinking as much
that night.
Yeah, so it was sort of a weird interview. I was trying to get Michael to do his songs, trying to keep Dan quiet, and at the same time get Dan when rather to sing a song and do some some of his kind of music. But I felt very uncomfortable. That was one of them, and the reason I put that on the list of things to talk about today is that I wanted to say it's not all peaches and cream. Not all these interviews are hunky-dory. Some of them turn out to be disasters. And, one time I had a terrible interview with Tim Buckley, who I had interviewed many years before. This is Jeff Buckley's father. Tim Buckley was a very popular singer at the time. And I had a great interview with him some years before. He was very pleasant. But I couldn't understand why he was so antagonistic 3 years down the pike. And I found out later that he had a fight in the street coming out of the main point after the show was closed with some wise guys who had been heckling him in the theater. And maybe they had been drinking too much. The main point was a coffee house. Yeah. So he had to get a beer across the street, bring it back in a styrofoam cup, right. One of those kind of deals. So I think a couple of guys were sort of heckling Tim Buckley, and he didn't appreciate that. So he started giving it back to them, and then the manager of the place threw the guys out. But they laid in wait for Tim Buckley. When he got out, they jumped him.
Oh, jeez.
And they started to beat him up. That was the night before he came on my show. So he wasn't, and he probably was hating Philadelphia.
Wasn't in a great mood there.
No, he wasn't in a great mood. And who did he take it out on? What? But, when I listened to the tape of that show years later, I was so embarrassed by that show because he kept asking me things like, why do you think it's so important to do a folk show? Why don't you do a classical show? I said, well, I like folk. That's why I'm not doing the classical. He was just trying to get me in a way.
Yeah.
But when I listened to the show years later, it wasn't so bad. He wasn't that bad. I think that maybe with my earphones on, thinking that everybody was hanging on every word that he said, and they would recognize the fact that I was a little put off by this and maybe a little nervous about it. But it wasn't that way at all. So it's your perception of things, I find, years later.
And we have a song here. Do I have the title right? Come On to My House?
Come On to My House? Yeah, that's a song that was popularized by Rosemary Clooney.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, she hated that song when she was asked to record it. In the old days, people didn't write their own songs. They used to, their managers would go buy a song for them, go down a Tin Pan Alley and go to a publishing house or to Nashville and say, you got a good song for my artist here, Julius LaRosa or Perry Como or Rosemary Clooney, and they'd say, oh, we got a great song for Rosemary, sort of a reggae, well, they didn't even have reggae, it was sort of a calypso-y kind of song called Come On to My House. But anyway, they played it for her, she hated it. She thought it was a dumb song, but you know what? It sold a zillion copies.
Did it really?
And then she started to like it.
I bet.
But she could pay all the bills, and she popularized it many, many years ago. And here's Dan Hicks and his Hot Licks doing a cover of Come On to My House, and they do it in a very funny way. And as the song trails off, you'll hear, Dan talking about the different things that'll entice you to come to your house. Coffee, a Vegematic. Come on, come on over to my house. I got a Vegematic. A Cuisinart.
And that song was Come On to My House by Dan Hicks and the Hot Licks, and my guest today is Gene Shay. Gene, we don't have a lot of time left, but I do have a couple more things I'd like to ask you.
Sure.
How can people hear you now at WXPN?
How can they?
How can they?
Well, they can live in the Philadelphia area.
Okay.
Or they can go on the internet to xpn.org, and there's somewhere on that screen it says listen, and they can hear what's on the air. I'm on Sunday nights starting at 8 o'clock. Eastern Standard Time.
So if somebody's listening from Japan, they got to figure that.
They could do it that way. They could hear me on my Folk Alley show, which is on Saturdays and Wednesdays. It's the repeat. The 2-hour section that I do on Saturday is repeated the following Wednesday. And that show comes over the internet only. It does not have a radio component. So there you get that by either going to folkalley.com, and I think you have to put your email address in, then click on listen, and you'll get it. Another way to go there is to, if you have iTunes, there's a little section on the front page of iTunes where it says podcasts radio. Click on radio.
Right.
You see a whole long list of different radio stations, everything from Margaritaville to Folk Alley. And click on Folk Alley, and all of a sudden you'll hear me. So it's Saturday, 5 p.m. to 7 Eastern Standard Time.
And they can also Google you.
They can Google me.
Gene Shay, S-H-A-Y.
I have my own website. Yeah,
That's right. That's correct. What is your website, Gene?
It's geneshay.com. It's easy. GENESHAY.com. And on my website, just like on my XPN website, there's a song list of what I play. So that's real helpful if you hear something while you're in your car and you can't write something down, you miss the title and you want to hear, oh, I love that. What did he play that around 9 o'clock or, around 10 o'clock? And it's interesting, on folkalley.com, if you're listening, you can get the title of the song is on the screen while you're listening to the song.
Well, that's like this show. Same thing.
Like your show, right?
Yeah,
so, which is terrific because sometimes I go back and I listen to my own show on Folk Alley and I hear part of a song that I don't remember. And I go, wait a minute, is that me? What am I playing? And then I look up and I say, oh, yeah, I remember that. I didn't realize that it had a bridge like that.
Right. I had to ask you this. I want to ask about another name and how your experiences with your music and this person, and it's Gloria, your wife.
Well, she can sing really well.
Yeah.
Actually, she sings really well. I mean, she does. And she, I met Gloria because when we were, I met her at a square dance, and I met her at a dance that was loaded with people who were into folk music. It was sort of the folk crowd. And I found out that she was taking guitar lessons right around the same time that I was taking guitar lessons. In fact, our teachers were friends. Our teachers were very good friends. So we got together. When I met her at the square dance, I said to my guitar teacher, hey, why don't you invite her over your house sometime and let me be there, do a little party kind of thing. And that's how and then we started practicing together. Wound up marrying the gal. So, but she doesn't sing much anymore. She always loved the folk music, and she still does. And she loves contemporary music and classical, and so it's been. So
she's taken the ride with you, so to speak.
Oh yeah, for 40, almost 50 years almost.
We're gonna go out on a Michael Nesmith song, and you mentioned him before. But before we do that, I wanted to say, I've interviewed some young performers. For example, Carsey Blanton from Philly, and also Liz Longley and a few other people. And I always ask them their influences, and they say Joni Mitchell, Simon and Garfunkel, people like that, because they're, number one, they listen to their parents' records as they were growing up.
Yeah.
But they also, I think, listen to your show as their parents turned your show on over the years. And they go to the Philadelphia Folk Festival. Some people have been there since they were babies.
Right.
And they hear you on stage introducing and talking about the performers. And it made me think of your influence of young performers all the way back to the 60s, like Bob Dylan, who's probably, 21 then, all the way up to today. And I was thinking, that's something. And
yeah, I'm sort of proud of that. When people come up to me and say, man, I've been listening to you all my life. I just had a group on my show just last week, a Celtic band called Sleight of Hand. And the guy who played the Celtic harp and sang with a really sweet voice, I complimented on his voice. He had like this sort of smoky kind of voice I like a lot. And after the show was over and we were like packing up and he was putting his harp away and I was getting ready to sign off, he came into the studio, shook my hand. He said, you turned me on to Stan Rogers 20 years ago. First time I ever heard him was on your show. And there was another thing you did one time that flipped me out, that made a real impression on him and changed his direction. And another case of that is this friend of mine who's a lawyer, who's very active. Now he owns a record label. He said I changed his life when I started playing Phil Oakes when he first heard him on the radio. It was on my show, and when he heard Phil Oakes, it just changed his direction. He was going to be a corporate lawyer. He decided to be a lawyer that did good things for people, working with Ralph Nader. In fact, he co-wrote a book with Ralph Nader. So, and then I have my relationship with my interviewer here, Ray Naylor, who for years tried to get on my show when he was just starting out, when he was a open mic singer. He even put my name in one of his songs, right?
And that got me on your song.
And it got you on my show, didn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
See, there's always a way to sneak in there.
It's always
I
a way
forgot that method. Put your name in a... No, but if I do that,
I've said that on stage. I said, this got me on Gene's show the first time. So if you want to go on the show, put his name in a song.
It doesn't always work, but a number of people have put my name on their songs, and I've been very pleased and delighted,
Gene, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I thank you on behalf of not just the Philadelphia folk scene and people involved with it, but I think all over the country for everything that you've done, which has been so much over the years.
Okay, right. Well, it's been the joy of my life to do what I do. I'm a very lucky person to be in this business, if you call it that, this art form business. And I would never change things in any shape or form for what I've done and what I've gone through and all the people that I've met and interviewers like you. So thanks.
Thank you.